I think the biggest issue when it comes to obesity and metabolic syndrome is a hyperinsulinemic state. So it's our body overproducing insulin. And this happens for two main reasons. We're told to eat a whooping 6 to 10 servings of grains a day or carbohydrates a day. It's quite ridiculous. I believe that probably the general population drinks more soda than they drink water, unfortunately. More butter, more coconut oil. It wasn't weird then, but it is weird now to tell people to not snack. People think that they're supposed to snack. Yeah. I think that we have now learned that it's definitely not the best tool to help with metabolic syndrome. It's an adjunct to overall health. People that have metabolic syndrome focus exclusively on exercise as a healing mechanism. They're not going to have great success.
Body-mind empowerment.
Get stronger, faster, smarter, quicker, friendlier, more helpful, more driven.
Everything the body needs.
Control your mind.
Welcome to the Body-Mind Empowerment Podcast. I'm your host, Simland, and our guest today is Nadia Pateguana, who's a licensed naturopathic doctor from Ontario, Canada. Her interest is in the human body's ability to heal itself and use it for improved wellness. Nadia, I want to welcome you to our show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sim.
Can you give us a little short overview of, what got you into naturopathic medicine?
Sure. So as you correctly stated, my training is in naturopathic medicine. I've been in clinical practice for about 15 years. I did go to school here in Canada, in Toronto, in North York, more specifically. My background is in biology. That was my undergraduate degree. My initial goal was to go to medical school. And then during university, I ran into some digestive concerns. I had IBS, and it affected my quality of life quite a bit. And so I decided to look into alternative treatments, and then decided to go into naturopathic medicine as my profession. So that was, I guess, 20 years ago now. And I started the naturopathic college, and in my journey, right after I finished the naturopathic college, I actually went to Southern Africa, which is where I'm originally from. I'm from a country called Mozambique. Nice. So I actually stayed in Mozambique for about 10 years. I worked a little bit with, I had a complementary sort of setting in my clinic. So we had other medical doctors, and myself, I was the naturopath. So people, the other doctors basically refer their patients to me for dietary counseling. So my focus has always been on diet and metabolic syndrome from the very beginning. So early on, I really had to navigate through this, because I don't think, I think just like in the medical profession, the conventional medical profession, naturopaths, we get a bit of nutrition training, but we don't really get very good specifics. So I sort of had to figure this out on my own about 15 years ago, trying to help people. Even in Mozambique, people's main concern, at least the people that came to see me, was weight, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, all the metabolic syndrome expressions that we see today. This was already happening 15 years ago in Mozambique. And that's, of course, the group of people that I saw. I didn't get to go on and see and do other naturopathic sort of approaches. It was diet that was my focus, and metabolic syndrome specifically. Eventually, things got a lot more interesting throughout my journey. I started to see more specific groups of people. And eventually, it actually got pretty focused for me I would say about 8 years ago. I went in, I had, again, my own concerns, health concerns. I was diagnosed with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, and I was struggling with infertility myself. And so I realized that I myself had developed metabolic syndrome. And in my journey, of course, to help myself and to create a family, which I luckily did. I have 2 children right now. In my journey, I learned I ended up stumbling upon this low carb diet and eventually intermittent fasting. So when I decided that it was time to leave Mozambique, I decided to return to Canada, and I met Dr. Jason Fung, at a conference. I was lucky enough to be with some of the South African people that I knew, and they knew Dr. Fung, and they there was somewhat of an introduction. And when upon our return to Toronto, Dr. Fung asked me to join him and Megan Ramos at their IDM clinic here in Toronto, specifically in Scarborough. So for the last couple of years, that's what I've been doing. I work exclusively for the IDM program, and IDM stands for Intensive Dietary Management program. So we have an in-office program, but at this moment in time, the biggest part of our program is our online dietary management program. So I'm one of the dietary coaches. We have grown. There's a few other dietary coaches besides myself. And so I don't actually work as a naturopath any longer. I work as a dietary coach for the IDM program. And that's a quick summary of my background.
Yeah, you kind of summed it up very nicely. You flew right through it like a storyline. And what would you say is the biggest difference between the dietary problems of people in Mozambique and the ones you treat in Canada at the moment?
So if you know a little bit about Mozambique, it's a quote-unquote developing country. The most, I think, prominent thing here that's relevant to your question is that Mozambique has a big dichotomy, right? They have very low-income people, and then they have a thriving middle to upper-class community. So what I find, unfortunately, is that in the middle to upper-class community, their globalization has kind of led people to have the exact same metabolic syndrome conditions that they have in your part of the world and my part of the world. So if anything, I was dealing more with people that had issues with obesity and hypertension and diabetes. And I wasn't, unfortunately, my initial intent when I went to Mozambique was to work with a completely different group of people, but that just wasn't available to me. And so the only thing that was available to me was to see these people that were happy and willing to come to me for weight loss. And so it is significantly different. Their diet is become very globalized. So it's a mixture of their traditional diet, which is more of a peanut-based with greens and some sort of grain like rice or corn based. There's a corn-based pap that people eat traditionally with a peanut curry. So peanut and greens curry. That is the traditional Mozambican diet. It's something that people now eat on occasion. By people I mean this specific middle to upper class community, because generally the general population still eats this on a daily basis. The other part of the community eats this on occasion, mostly on holidays as part of their celebratory meals, and every other day they eat just like the rest of the world, French fries and lots of chicken. People in Mozambique love chicken. We have great chicken. And with great spices, and so they eat with a lot of junk food, a lot of pop. There's a lot of, or soda, as some will call it. So there's a lot of Coca-Cola, Fanta, and all these other things. I believe that probably the general population drinks more soda than they drink water, unfortunately. Lots of juices. And children are subjected to that same sort of diet as in the developing world. Lots of snacks throughout the day. I think parents all over the world are afraid that their children will die if they don't snack every 2 hours. And so metabolic syndrome develops quite quickly, unfortunately, and quite early. So there's a lot of childhood obesity in that community.
Yeah, it's true. Like there's a common pattern that low-income families, they tend to have poorer metabolic health as well, because they don't have, maybe they simply don't have access to that much better food, or they simply have too much other stress and these other conditions that make them less healthy. And it's a common pattern indeed. So what would be like the most common causes of these very, very common diseases, like obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome?
I think that if you read a little bit about Dr. Fung, so Dr. Fung is the medical doctor that I work with currently. If you read a little bit about his background, he's written 3 books now. He's had his 3rd book, The Diabetes Code, is coming out. It's come out in Canada already. It's coming out in the States, and I think in parts of the world in April. His first book, The Obesity Code, was quite popular. His second book was as well. The Complete Guide to Fasting. But in his first book, I think he pinpoints the most important factor here, which is the insulin factor. So insulin is obviously a hormone that our body should produce, naturally produces, in response to food and other things. I think the biggest issue when it comes to obesity and metabolic syndrome is a hyperinsulinemic state. So it's our body overproducing insulin in the majority of the cases. And this happens I think for two main reasons. Number one is that our diet worldwide, whether it's Mozambique or here in Canada or where you're from, unfortunately our dietary guidelines in the late 70s and 80s all over the world changed quite drastically, and people were told to eat a whooping 6 to 10 servings of grains a day or carbohydrates a day. It's quite ridiculous. So number one, we've increased our carbohydrate intake, our sugar and grain intake tremendously. And number two, we started back in the 80s eating these small meals many times a day. So it's a twofold problem. It's just eating way too many refined carbs and just eating way too many times a day. So there's a constant insulin response that is happening. So carbohydrates create a very high insulin response, meaning that your body produces more insulin when you eat more carbohydrates. And every time that you do eat, you produce insulin. You create this insulin response. And so the more times that you eat, the more your insulin rises. And this leads to a hyperinsulinemic state, so a higher than desired insulin level. And it leads to insulin resistance, which eventually, as we know, leads to diabetes. So when people hear insulin, they only think diabetes. But there's a bit of a spectrum here. You could be on different levels of the spectrum when it comes to producing too much insulin. You might not necessarily be diabetic right away. There's a bit of a journey, and some people do become diabetic quite early on. In fact, I read something yesterday that the biggest rise in diabetes is actually in adolescence, type 2 diabetes, which is horrendous. Horrendous. Obesity and diabetes, it's actually the sort of the pocket of our community that has the biggest rise right now is adolescence. You shouldn't be getting you shouldn't get diabetes, period, but you shouldn't be getting diabetes until you're much later on in life, right? The spectrum should be here, but it's not.
Yeah,
and so those are the two main things: too many carbs and eating too often.
Yeah, it's true. Like the school system also kind of forces it, and you have to be eating a lot of carbs and sugars and fruit and all the time, and you actually won't allow your body to enter into this fat burning state, in a sense, where you have low insulin. So yeah, it's constantly high.
In defense of the school system in hospitals and all public establishments are required to follow the dietary guidelines. So I don't think the school system is the problem. They are required to follow the dietary guidelines. And the current dietary guidelines are to eat many times a day and a high level of carbohydrates, not to mention a lot of other specific things. So the fact that our diet is also riddled with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. This is another major issue, which is also started at about the same time. Just about the same time that people started to eat more carbs, they started to consume more industrialized fats, as opposed to the natural healthy fats that we should be focusing on, like good old butter. And I know in your part of the world, it's just as prominent as it is. It's starting to be here. More butter, more coconut oil, more, Anyway, lots of other healthy fats, avocados and avocado oil.
So what does your program recommend people to follow instead? What kind of dietary recommendations?
We do recommend a low carb, high fat diet. So that's kind of what my sort of journey led me to, personally and professionally. For the last at least 8 years, I've been recommending a low carb, high fat diet. But our program focuses most exclusively, not exclusively, but it is a fasting program. So this is what Dr. Fung is known for. This is what he lectures all over the world on. Him and Megan Ramos. They lecture on intermittent fasting as well as some extended fasting protocols. So we monitor people through intermittent fast, which could be anything from skipping snacks. That would be key. Having main meals and no snacks, that would be ideal, which is what people used to do until the 70s. It wasn't weird then, but it is weird now to tell people to not snack. People think that they're supposed to snack. Yeah. Children are supposed to snack. And so focusing on main meals, avoiding snacks. And some people will go on to skipping a meal. So doing intermittent fasting patterns. I personally follow an 18-6 intermittent fasting schedule on my eating days, which means that I eat 2 meals a day in a 6-hour period, and I fast for 18 hours, which is great. Makes me feel great. I eat very well when I do eat. So I eat enough and properly when I do eat. So 2 main meals, and some alternate day fasting or longer fasting periods. And that could be anywhere from 24 to 36 to 42-hour intermittent fasts. And some people will with proper supervision, will go on to do some extended fasts.
Yeah, it's true. Like you mentioned, that it's actually a cultural issue in a sense that people frowning upon skipping meals and frowning upon eating these kind of low carb meals, and they think that it's unhealthy or it's even dangerous. So it's a cultural issue. Like the idea of doing intermittent fasting, even as little as skipping breakfast or something like that, that's going to actually cause a lot of people are going to freak out because of it, and it's
No doubt about it.
a cultural mindset thing, it's quite a huge problem. So it's definitely something that needs to be fixed or gradually overcome with some work. So I think you're heading in the right direction with your programs. So do you have mostly men or female patients?
At this point, we have a mixture. I think traditionally, premenopausal or postmenopausal women tended to be the group of people that searched for dietary programs. Nowadays, we have a wide range. We don't see children because it is primarily a fasting program, and even though we believe in fasting and we get great benefits from fasting, it's not a good idea to put children through fasting, and we don't recommend that in the least bit. So we don't see any children. We only see adults. I myself have 2 children, and my children have 3 meals a day without any snack. So if you want to call that fasting, then great. I think that's great. But aside from that, that's about what they do. They're growing and growing quite well and in a very healthy pattern. So our patients right now, our patient population is both men and women, and anywhere from people in their 20s trying to do this for prevention purposes. A lot of people in their 20s already have metabolic syndrome, so this is a growing concern, as I said, and men and women in different stages of their lives.
So what's the difference between men and women while they're fasting? Do they need to approach it differently? Or?
I think that from a physiological perspective, I don't think so. From a lifestyle perspective and psychological perspective, it might be quite different. I think still traditionally all over the world, women tend to be the caregivers in the home. It's not the case for everybody. I have many patients who tell me that their husbands or male spouse are the cooks in the house, which is great. But I think that, if you're a woman that's primarily in charge of the cooking for your family and you want to fast, that might be an initial sort of hurdle because it might be more difficult to decide to fast if you're having to cook for people. I think it's something that people tend to overcome quite easily. Fasting is a voluntary choice. So when people decide to fast, they're doing it out of their own sort of free will. There is Dr. Fung likes to say that fasting is like exercising a muscle. You get better at it as you go, depending on the diet that you follow. So of course, if you follow a low carb, high fat diet, we've clinically seen that people have a much greater ease with fasting when people do follow a higher carb diet. And a lot of people want to maintain their higher carb diet, but still get the benefits of fasting. And it is possible, but it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult to go from a high insulin state, so eating lots of carbs, to then going to a fasting state, which requires your body to go on your own reserves. And it's much more difficult to switch from one to the other. It's much easier to go from a sort of low carb, high fat diet, which your body already is in a lower insulin state, so a more fat burning state, into a fasting state. So that is easier. So, I know that there's a lot of information out there that says that women, because of something or other, have a hard time fasting. I don't find that at all. I'm a woman, I fast. My biggest issue with fasting was that I had to really work on my hydration. water and sodium intake in order to be able to fast longer than, the regular time period that I normally fast. Everybody fasts, right? I mean, even if it is for just the period of time that you're sleeping, you're fasting. That's why the first meal is called breakfast. It's break fast. So fasting is a natural state that everybody goes through. It is, as you said earlier, ideally, the homeostatic balance is that you're burning and storing and burning and storing. If you're storing all the time, which is what people are starting to do, they're constantly eating, there's going to be an imbalance.
Yeah, and I also believe that if you do practice intermittent fasting, then you're going to, like Dr. Funk said, you're going to build up your fasting muscle in a sense. You become more keto adapted, and your body becomes more efficient at using its own body fat for fuel, and you're going to experience less hunger. You're going to have more mental clarity despite the presence or despite the lack of food. And you also protect your muscle tissues and things like that against the catabolism. You're not going to lose your vital organs just because you skipped breakfast or something like that. It's actually a very important part of the physiology that you don't want to lose.
100%. And more energy. The one thing that people cannot fathom and are pleasantly surprised is that they actually feel more energy when they fast and not less energy, even though they're consuming maybe less exogenous. So they don't have to put in a fuel from the outside. They get to burn their own fuel, which provides it's a very stable source of energy, as opposed to this up and down source of energy when you're eating and not eating higher carbs, right? There's a spike, and then there's a dip, and then that feels very unwell after a while.
Yeah. So how long do you recommend people to fast for?
So on a regular basis, as I said, which is what I call my eating days, which is most days, I recommend a 16-8 or an 18-6 sort of pattern, which means that you fast for 16 to 18 hours and you eat 2 meals, because it's important to not be grazing all day during your eating window, two smaller eating windows. So that's our just general recommendation. So as you said, it might be a shocker for people that you're eating 2 meals a day and that you're skipping a meal. You don't have to skip breakfast. You could eat breakfast and then a late lunch. So then you finish eating by 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is great. You're going to have much less of an insulin response if you eat your food before sunset. So, of course, as the seasons change, that can change as well. Or some people choose to have a lunch and a dinner, because dinner is a time of family and of being with other people and sharing a meal with other people. So maybe they would have, an early lunch and a dinner, which is great. I play between those two schedules. As I said, a lot of our patients or clients in our program are doing some more intermittent fasting schedules, some different intermittent fasting schedules like alternate day fasting, or even some extended fasts with some supervision. And that's because these are people that are going from an excess point and they're trying to reverse their metabolic syndrome. So, a maintenance sort of approach would be different than somebody trying to heal.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I definitely noticed myself that skipping breakfast is a lot more convenient for most people, because you're already not hungry after you wake up, or you can use that mental clarity to do some work during the day, and dinner is usually associated with more these family gatherings. So but what do you allow your patients to consume while fasting, besides regular water and sodium?
That it depends. It depends. I think a lot of people, as we get to know the benefits of fasting a little bit better, and in 2016, the Nobel Prize for Physiology was won by a Japanese physicist who talked about how fasting can trigger this thing called autophagy, which a lot of people talk about now, which is the body's ability to sort of eat away at its sort of garbage and dead parts and dead protein. And there's so much more to autophagy that we don't even understand. But really, there are so many benefits to fasting that we are learning throughout time. And we kind of, if you look at our history, we know there are benefits to fasting. It's been used throughout the history of human beings as a way to heal, as a way to express spirituality, religion, and everything else. So, it's not something new. Let's just put it that way. And there are known benefits to fasting. So as people get to know more about this and get to learn about an ancient practice, again, they start to, most of the time I find people are trying to learn how to fast, how to have a cleaner fast. So a fast that we do believe that water and sodium is a requirement to fasting. And as I said to you, I myself, my only obstacle, or my biggest obstacle to fasting, wasn't hunger or lack of energy. It was dehydration. So that's a big thing. But there are a lot of things that people choose to have, or we call them sort of crutches or training wheels to get people fasting a little longer. And that's, bone broth is very known in this sort of group of people in this lifestyle. Bone broth, because of the benefits and the electrolytes and all the other components that you can get from, and all our great grandmothers used to make bone broth. Again, not a new thing. I personally do make bone broth, and I do consume bone broth, but I don't consume it during my fast. I consume it on my eating days. But it is something that can help people get through a fast. There are electrolytes in there, so it'll help with dehydration, and some nutrients if you need that little push to fast a little longer. Other people will do some fats. Again, keeping in mind that fat produces an insignificant insulin response. So it's something that you can use as a little push, a little added fuel, without having your insulin go up during your fasting periods. And so I'm talking about, coconut oil again, or any of MCT oil or avocado oil. People will use different types of oils to push through a fast, just to add a little bit. Again, it's not something you want to be having all the time. These are short periods of fasting. You just want your body to be able to clean up a little bit and sort of burn a little bit until you go and store again, right? So you don't really, if you're doing shorter periods of fasting, you probably eventually anyway, you won't really need anything. You'll feel just fine without any detriment to your health, quite the opposite. But if you need a little push, there's a few things that you can intake.
Yeah, I agree that during the initial, fat adaptation period where where your fasting muscle isn't that strong yet, then it can be a good idea to use these kinds of bone broth and bulletproof coffees to satiate yourself and to keep your body nourished. But later, I believe it would be better to skip these kinds of things because, like we mentioned, like autophagy. And I'm afraid these bulletproof coffees or MCT oils, they can actually inhibit autophagy. And I would rather.
We don't know too much, but we're pretty confident that any amount of fuel calorie would inhibit autophagy.
Yeah, and the same.
Which is fine.
Which is fine.
Not everybody's fasting for autophagy. Autophagy might be a different stage, a different level, a different goal. A later goal, but if you are looking into autophagy, and many people are,
you don't want to have autophagy 24/7 either, because I would imagine you would eat up all your tissues. So there are different reasons why to do fasting, and ketosis and fat loss are one, and autophagy and those are the other. So it comes down to the individual and their goals. But what about stuff like dry fasting? Have you had any experience with this?
I do not. I don't. I even use caution when talking about that, because I don't think that I know enough. I have zero experience with dry fasting. I have never recommended it to anyone. I do know of people that believe in dry fasting. I've talked to some people who believe in it and have wanted to have a conversation with me about it. I do not have. I have no comfort level around that. So dry fasting, meaning a fast without any water or electrolytes. Of course, again, we all dry fast for a certain amount of time. We all sleep, and most of us don't drink when we're sleeping, and that's a short period of time. How long can we go without water and electrolytes? I have no idea, and I at this point I have no interest in finding out.
It would be another wise idea to try and test your limits, so to say, to push yourself to that extremes.
I would not recommend it. at all.
Well,
I tell you that even when I fasted with water and very little salt, I couldn't make it through, you know, even 20 hours. I felt very, very unwell. So I specifically know that in order for me to fast, I need a lot of water and sodium.
I think it can be done, and it can be very effective and healthy, but you simply first have to become very well adapted to fasting, and then you have to know what you're actually doing. So you don't want to do it if you have no idea what you're doing. So it requires a lot of practice.
You know, I like to think that I respect people's approaches and their own individual approaches. I would never recommend that to somebody, and I would never want to be responsible. And I would never, personally, I don't think that it would work for me. So I'm just going to have to make do with water fasting. But I would be very cautious about people recommending that to other people.
Yeah, true. But what about we mentioned that you wouldn't recommend children to fast. So I would imagine that the same would apply to women who are pregnant or breastfeeding.
100%.
Right.
It's a growing period. It's not a period for fasting. It's also not a period for excess storage, as people would like to believe. There's a lot of complications that come with an unhealthy pregnancy. I'm actually writing quite a bit about that lately. You know, gestational diabetes, obesity during pregnancy, that comes with complications for not just the mother, but the fetus. And I think this is something that women are not aware of. They're not aware that their insulin status during pregnancy is going to have long-term effects on their child.
Yeah, it's true. Like it becomes an excuse, almost like I'm pregnant, I can eat whatever I want because I'm eating for two. And yeah, they don't know that the epigenetics are going to have a huge impact on the future health of the child. So
huge impact.
Yeah.
A lot bigger than people think. I actually believe that the current obesity epidemic that we have in children is due to unhealthy pregnancies.
So, like, they're not going to do fasting, but what kind of nutrition plan would they follow? Should they still follow this kind of a low carb ketogenic meal?
I cannot think of one human being that I wouldn't recommend a low carb, high fat diet to. Not one. I haven't yet come across one person that I would say would not benefit from a low carb, high fat diet. A problem with women when they're pregnant, switching to a low carb, high fat diet from a regular diet is that they can be again exposed to this period of dehydration. So if it was properly supervised and if they had enough information, they could very easily transition. And a lot of women end up transitioning because they develop gestational diabetes. And the conventional, unfortunate recommendation is that they still consume high carb and they just inject or they take medication. But a lot of women choose to change their diet during pregnancy to prevent or to resolve gestational diabetes. So it's totally plausible. I actually believe it to be the healthiest diet, both pre-pregnancy. So this is a big thing, and this is what I'm writing a bit about on right now. Preparing your body for pregnancy is key, I think, in order to prevent complications and in order to spare your child of unnecessary metabolic syndrome. And then, you know, maybe one day I'll talk a little bit more or focus a little bit more on diet during pregnancy, which is not something I focus on very much. We are a fasting program. Even my patients that get pregnant, which luckily for me, lots of our patients search for our help to get pregnant, and they successfully get pregnant, which is really my passion. A lot of these women choose to get some advice from me about diet throughout pregnancy, and they take a little break from our fasting program, of course, because they're pregnant, and then they go on to breastfeed, most of them. And so I don't really follow at this moment in time many pregnant or breastfeeding women, except to prepare them for pregnancy and then hopefully guide them on a better diet during pregnancy.
Yeah, like especially if the woman is pregnant, then they're more sensitive to these different changes in their nutrition, and they're more their hormones are more vulnerable in a sense. So is it true that fasting can mess up women's hormones, or they can miss their periods or something?
It is true that fasting has a hormonal effect, and that most of the time is beneficial. Okay, so that's the whole point of fasting. The whole theory behind obesity and metabolic syndrome that we believe in is the insulin theory, which is a hormone. So it is true that fasting has a hormonal effect. Now, is it detrimental? Most of the time it's not. It's quite positive. It will put you in a better hormonal balance. Most of the time, women's concern is that they don't get a regular period when they have metabolic syndrome or PCOS like I had, and so they don't ovulate. And so they want, not that they want, but once they learn about fasting, they realize that fasting can actually cause a better hormonal balance, and this will ultimately look like more regular periods and more regular ovulation. Now, to do that during pregnancy would first of all make no sense, and second of all not be a recommendation.
But what about the thyroid hormones? A lot of people tend to suffer from those as well, hypothyroidism, especially if they're doing like fasting.
I don't believe that fasting creates hypothyroidism. I believe that women and men that have an abnormal thyroid level need to have that addressed and controlled through medication. Just like type 1 diabetics who don't produce enough insulin need to take exogenous insulin. People with abnormal thyroid levels need to have that controlled as well with proper medication.
Yeah,
I definitely don't.
So it's like a separate thing, caused by the other lifestyle factors.
It could be. It could be genetic. It could be a whole bunch of other things. Some people have tumors from their thyroid that have to be removed, and so part of the function is lost. There's many different reasons why people would have thyroid abnormalities. I definitely don't think that a ketogenic diet or fasting would cause damage or harm to the thyroid gland.
Especially if you couple it up with proper feeding and getting enough micronutrients during the actual eating phase. So that's a crucial part as well of
it's
fasting.
Crucial.
Yeah.
For everybody. In order to fast, you have to feast properly. So we believe in a fasting and feasting approach.
Yeah. So how do you break a fast then, and what do you recommend to people eat then?
It depends. I mean, if you're doing a sort of shorter intermittent fasting schedule, your meal that you break your fast with is just a regular meal. So myself, for example, when I do a 16 or 18-hour fast, my first meal is a ketogenic. My diet is ketogenic, so it's a strict low carb, high fat diet, moderate protein. And so my first meal and my second meal are rich nutrients, full of nutrients, from a high fiber, low carb vegetables, and a moderate amount of protein from different sources. I eat a different range of proteins. I do eat animal proteins, and personally, although I have many patients who do not, who are vegetarian or pescatarians or whatever else they choose to or believe is best for them. And then I have a high fat diet. So my two meals are large, nutrients rich. If I do on the occasions that I do longer fasts, which I do, I do a 3 to 5 day fast about once a month. It's something I aim for autophagy and all the other things we talked about. But when I do a longer fast, breaking that fast is a lot more. It's a lot different.
Typical.
It's atypical. It's an atypical way because my body has less digestive enzymes at that point in time. The body is kind of not produced as many as it normally would because I haven't been eating. And so I would break it with something smaller just to get some digestive enzymes going. And then later on I would have a larger meal, or I might just have one meal on the day that I break a fast, but have it in sort of a gradual approach just to get my digestive enzymes going. And different people will have an easier ability to break a fast than others. So some will have to break it slower. And again, remember that people that are fasting, believe in fasting, have had great benefits of fasting, and are usually pretty well educated on the subject matter, I hope. And so they know their body, and they know that, okay, this fast, I need to break it a little slower so that I don't have a digestive upset. Otherwise, you could feel very bloated, unwell. You don't have enough digestive enzymes. That food could go right through you. You could get loose stools. You could get constipation. You could get a lot of unpleasant feelings if you were to break a longer fast inappropriately. So it's stuff that we learn along the way and we coach people on.
But do you think like something like this carb cycling or having a few days where you consume more carbs and getting off the ketogenic diet, would it be beneficial for health and longevity?
I don't think it's beneficial. I know that a lot of people believe that it is. I'm not sure how that makes any sense. Why would you want to spike somebody's insulin at different periods of time? Personally, I don't see any benefits to it, and there's a lot of reasons why I don't see benefits to it, particularly because I see people with metabolic syndrome. So they have no benefit from going back into a more metabolic syndrome status, number one. Number two, a lot of people, myself included, are very addicted to carbs and are very have a very sort of unhealthy relationship with carbs. And so when they eat carbs, it creates a lot of a binging tendency. People think that fasting creates binging. It does not at all. If anything, fasting will decrease that insulin status and it makes you less crave these sort of foods less. However, people that eat a lot of carbs and then fast will want to eat, will crave because they don't get that out of their system. And so they're constantly craving. They go through that withdrawal phase. But if you get rid of that, if you eat different foods, your cravings go down. So if you're constantly putting people through this cycle, it's very unpleasant. And it also, you could be going through that whole electrolyte imbalance over and over and over again. So it does not make any sense to me, to be honest. What I do think is that the human nature is we're not perfect. If you see keto as perfection, which I personally think it's pretty close to perfection, I just don't think that people can stay keto. Some people can stay keto all the time. Some people choose to and do very well. I did very, very well on a strict keto diet for a long period of time. That was my choice, and that's how I overcame my metabolic syndrome, and I felt very, very well. I'm currently in a maintenance phase, and so it's a lot of this, and it's not as easy. And so I do think that there is some sort of involuntary or unwanted carb cycling that can happen. And so the question is, how do you get over that? What do you do after you've had higher carbs? Because it puts your body in a totally different state. Puts your body in a retention state. You feel very bloated. You feel a lot of craving, and it can even affect some people's emotional stability, myself included. If I eat more carbs, it does have I have PCOS, or at least I have a history of PCOS, which has some sympathetic nervous system effects, and so it does affect my emotional stability. I feel a lot better. There's a lightness that comes in, a lot more energy that also comes with being in a lower carb diet all the time.
I think it's also like a matter of context, because like you said, people who have metabolic syndrome, then they definitely wouldn't benefit from having these insulin spikes or carb cycling. But I would imagine someone who is training hard or who is an athlete or someone, they can actually use those carbs to strategically boost their performance. And
that's a very good point. And that's and we have been, this is something that's been brought up to us all the time. Myself, Megan, and Dr. Fung, as well as our other dietary coaches, we see a handful of athletes. I actually personally don't see any, except for maybe recreational athletes. I know that Megan and Dr. Fung do support a couple of professional athletes. That is not the audience that we are speaking to most of the time.
Yeah, definitely. So it's still a matter of context.
So it's not even something I feel like I am, if I'm an expert in anything, which I don't think that I would call myself that, but I definitely, that is not my focus, is not professional athletes who need to carb cycle. And I don't even know that they do, to be fully honest. I think that there's enough people out there that have trained athletes and now focus on metabolic syndrome who don't believe in carb cycling either. So
and unfortunately, a lot of athletes who are exercising at high levels, they still have metabolic syndrome and diabetes, so they would still benefit from having following a low carb diet and doing it.
Bingo. I think we know that although exercise is an excellent and necessary tool for humans, I think that we have now learned that it's definitely not the best tool to help with metabolic syndrome. It's an adjunct to overall health. But if people's people that have metabolic syndrome focus exclusively on exercise as a healing mechanism, they're not going to have great success, unfortunately.
That's
I wish
true.
that they did, but they don't.
Yeah. If it were only in, calories out, then it'd be so easy. Yeah.
Right. Well, it would be easy for some people who are very good. I have a lot of patients who are morbidly obese, diabetics, and they exercise tons. They're not, as Dr. Fung would say, these are not lazy people.
Yeah.
Okay. As much as the medical profession sometimes likes to think that people become obese or diabetic because they're lazy and gluttons, that is not true.
That's right. Yeah. And what would be some, like, do you recommend taking some supplements for managing your blood sugars and insulin?
No, personally, we don't. It's all about the diet. I mean, there's sometimes people are deficient in something and they need to supplement with that. It's not what we normally see. Again, we see people with metabolic syndrome, so we see people with a disease of excess, not a disease of deficiency. So it's very rare that the people that we encounter have deficiencies of any sort. Sometimes people might have a vitamin D deficiency or a B12 deficiency or some sort of electrolyte deficiency, and that needs to be addressed.
But what about things like metformin or the very commonly prescribed for most people?
Our program is a dietary program, so we give zero medical recommendations. We do require that people have proper medical supervision. So there are always medical requirements for different people. As I mentioned earlier, some people have thyroid concerns, and that needs to be addressed. Some people have all kinds of concerns. There's all kinds of things that people have when they come to see us.
Yeah, it's true. Like, you can't, it has to, you have to fix the root cause, not the symptoms, in a sense of prescribing them with some pharmaceuticals that are only going to fix the surface level problems, and they're going to leave the root cause there. So it's still it's a lifestyle thing. Yeah. So,
and Dr. Fung is a medical doctor. He's a nephrologist. He's a kidney specialist. So obviously his patients that he sees, very often he has to put them on some sort of medication or other treatments like dialysis for kidney failure. So of course that's his scope of practice, and that is what he does. That is not my scope of practice. I am a dietary coach. So specifically I'm a fasting coach. So I'm here to help people fast. Sometimes there needs to be some adjustment to medication for people to be able to fast, but that has to be done with their medical doctor.
So what do you think is the biggest problem in mainstream medicine right now?
I don't think that's for me to say. Personally, I don't want to go to war with anybody. I think that what I tell my patients, and I think the biggest complaint that we get from patients, is that they wish that their medical doctor was more supportive of a ketogenic diet or a fasting protocol, because they've personally seen great benefits with it, and they would like to have sort of their two consultants, our program and their medical doctor on the same side. And very often that doesn't happen. A lot of conventional medical doctors don't know enough about this, don't care to know enough about this, and don't really believe in it because this is not how they were trained. They were trained with the whole calorie in, calorie out theory of obesity or metabolic syndrome. So I think that things are changing, will change over time. I think that, as we were talking about schools before, I don't think schools are the problem. I think that the whole structure of our dietary guidelines and our sort of institutionalized approach to diet is the main issue. Can we change that? I hope so. It probably will have to be this sort of bottom-up sort of approach, as people will have to revolutionize and hopefully get some changes to this. There would need to be some serious changes to our dietary guidelines in order for people to improve their health.
What kind of changes would you think should be immediately done, or what should be fundamental changes?
I think our labeling laws are terrible all over the world. I think that the general dietary guideline is horrible. It's still, in most dietary guidelines, they're still recommending that people have these polyunsaturated vegetable oils, and I think that's pretty big poison, and it's still being recommended for people, as heart health, and the heart associations all over the world and the obesity associations all over the world are recommending that people eat low fat still. This is a major issue. And this idea, even yesterday, I read something for PCOS and fertility. They're recommending that women, same sort of thing, eat many small meals throughout the day to keep their blood sugars stable. This is what causes metabolic syndrome, one of the reasons for metabolic syndrome in the first place. So how are you helping somebody by telling them to eat more often? You're not. And to eat whole grains, again, you're going to have higher insulin responses. If your problem is insulin, and a lot of the people that, well, obviously we see, but a lot of the concerns all over the world, this is one of the primary concerns, right? Obesity, diabetes, and now cancer. Now we know there's a huge link between sugar and cancer. So between insulin and cancer. And so how are we helping people by telling them to eat more often and more carbs? We're not.
Yeah, even like not just cancer, also like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, those are all getting tied back to blood sugar management and insulin. So it's
100%.
it's a huge issue, and
it seems like there's one common factor here that people are just not wanting to get. I think maybe some people don't know about it, and some people just ignore it.
Yeah, and one of the easiest ways, or the most proven ways, or the most effective ways so far that we have are, low carb ketogenic dieting and fasting. And it's weird, why it hasn't been supported that much yet. So we still have a lot of room to grow as a society.
This is why I said to you, I haven't yet come across one person that I would say a ketogenic diet or a low carb, high fat diet will be harmful for. Not one person. Yet it is still to this day, very often when they talk about diets, they'll call the keto diet the most fad diets or the most dangerous diets, and I'm not quite sure how that's even possible. It's the only approach. It's been used forever and ever. I mean, it's been used for children with epilepsy since before the 1920s. That should tell you a lot. If a ketogenic diet can help people with epilepsy, children with epilepsy, that's for me, that's tells me a lot. It might not make sense to people that I'm saying this, but if you look into it, it would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it really, if you understand the physiology a little bit and you understand how your body works, then it can indeed look like a very sustainable diet. And I totally agree that like it's one of the best diets currently that we as humans have managed to come up with, in a sense.
It's extremely sustainable. I know that people say that it's not sustainable because socially it might seem like it wouldn't be sustainable, but physiologically it's extremely sustainable. It's rich, very high nutrients, obviously, adequate amounts of macro and micronutrients. And like I said, for those of us that have some, unhealthy relationships with food, if you are in a ketogenic state, consuming a proper ketogenic diet, you are not craving, not struggling. This is not a willpower game. That for me is key, because that's what helped me personally.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about your program with Dr. Fung? What does it look like, or how can people learn more about it?
Okay, so I can give you our website. It's idmprogram.com. So as I said, IDM stands for Intensive Dietary Management Program.com. We currently have an online dietary program with a few different coaches. It is a group program, which means that people get individualized care within a group context, which is important, I think, because you not only get to talk to a coach one-on-one, but you get to listen into other people's journeys, experiences, questions. It's very interactive, very supportive. There's a big community feel to it, which is really very positive. And so that's currently what we offer. Dr. Fung, as I mentioned, is a nephrologist. Megan works with him personally with their patients, and he continues to be a practicing medical doctor here in Ontario. So his focus is nephrology, so he sees kidney patients. But the IDM program in and of itself is a online dietary program.
So anyone can, enroll in it, no matter what place of the world they're watching from.
That's right. So the majority of our patients are currently in the United States, We have some Canadian patients. Of course, we're in Canada, Australian, UK, all over Europe, all over Asia. We have a whole bunch of, the Middle East. You name it. I have patients from all over the world. It's a great way to communicate with people. It's a great way to especially because the fact that it's an online program, it allows people to have as much support as they need as far as frequency of calls. It's very interactive, and it has worked out quite well. We've been doing this for a little while now.
Because most people of the world are diabetic. Even the biggest populations like India and China, they have a lot of issues with diabetes as well. So it's great that you can do it, worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We do have a big, even here in Toronto, we have a big Asian community, and that seems to be, their disease, without a doubt.
Might be a cultural thing again.
It's a combination of factors. I think it's a genetic factor combined with this whole globalization, as I was telling you about Mozambique. It's a mixture of their own cultural diet with a huge sort of sugar insurgence from sort of Western, although I don't think it's a Western diet any longer. I think it's a global diet.
Yeah. Well, Nadia, I've really enjoyed talking with you on this podcast, and I'm also going to ask one of my last questions, which would be like, what would be this advice or practice or a habit that you wished you'd adopted earlier that improved your body and mind?
Fasting, no doubt. At least proper periods of fasting. What got me in trouble to begin with, besides my poor dietary choices, was the fact that I ate too often. I would eat small meals. In fact, I wouldn't eat meals. I didn't like meals. I hated meat and vegetables. All I wanted to do was eat carbs, and so I would eat a very small amount every couple of hours. That's what got me in trouble. I wasn't even obese by the time I had metabolic syndrome. I had basically everything else, and that was caused by frequent snacking. No doubt about it. It's not a genetic thing. My family doesn't suffer from metabolic syndrome. My mother doesn't suffer from metabolic syndrome. I created this myself, unfortunately, because I didn't know better.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. But luckily, you're on the right track, I believe.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you mentioned the websites where people can get in touch with Dr. Fung and your program. But what about your own personal social media platforms, or where can people find you personally?
I do have a website. I also have a Facebook page. At this point, I work exclusively for IDM. So anything that I do is somehow related to IDM. But I do have a website. My website is drnadia.com. So you spell Dr. DOCTOR and then my first name, NADIA.com. I share a lot of stuff on there. I have a blog. I share recipes, a lot of information about fasting, and very little about fasting, actually. Most of the fasting information comes from our IDM website, but a lot about the ketogenic diet and my own personal preferences and opinions.
Well, thank you for coming onto the show, Nadia, and definitely I wish you great luck and some more accomplishments in the field of medicine, and I hope that people do find their way to your program, and if they need to improve their health. And I believe that it's indeed something that's going to be the norm in the future, so you're heading in the right direction, I believe.
Thank you. This was very nice of you, and it was a pleasure.
I enjoyed. Yeah, thank you. That's it for this episode. Make sure you leave us a review on iTunes and other social media platforms. And other than that, subscribe, click the like, notification bell as well, like always. Thanks for watching. My name is Seem. Stay optimal, stay empowered.